My name is Raven Cole, and I built Urban 24 Group out of a two-man framing crew and $11,000 I scraped together from selling my mother's jewelry. I was 26 then. No investors believed in me. No bank wanted to lend to a black woman with a business plan and a dream of revitalizing neighborhoods everyone else had written off. I didn't wait for permission. I picked up a hammer myself, learned to read blueprints by lamplight, and by the time I was 34, Urban 24 Group had transformed 6 city blocks that used to be considered unlivable into the most sought-after residential corridor in the state. I did that. Me. Not my husband. Not his mother. Me. But here is the thing nobody tells you about building an empire from nothing. It teaches you to survive on silence. It teaches you that asking for help looks like weakness, that showing exhaustion looks like failure, that the moment you let your guard down is the moment someone takes what you built. I married Siobhan when I was 29. He was charming, ambitious, and hungry in a way that used to remind me of myself. I thought hunger like that made him an equal. I thought it made him safe. I gave him a title, Chief Operating Officer, because I loved him, and because I believed a marriage meant building side by side. I was wrong about what kind of hunger he had. For years, I watched him take credit in rooms I wasn't invited into. I watched him shake hands at ribbon cuttings while I was still on site in steel-toed boots, checking load-bearing calculations myself because I trusted my own eyes more than anyone else's. I told myself it didn't matter who got the spotlight, as long as the company thrived. I told myself that was maturity, that was leadership, that was keeping the peace. It wasn't. It was me disappearing in slow motion, one accommodation at a time. His mother, Zora, joined the company 2 years into our marriage. I brought her in myself, a gesture of goodwill, a way of saying you're my family now too. I gave her a seat on the board. I gave her access to vendor contracts. I gave her the kind of trust you only give someone you believe shares your blood, even when they don't. That was my fatal mistake, not loving them, trusting silently and calling it strength. I noticed things, over time, small things, a vendor invoice that didn't match the work completed, a signature on a permit application that looked like mine but wasn't quite mine. A property transfer request filed under my late mother's name, my mother, who died 4 years ago and left me the historic house in Collier Heights that raised me. The one thing in this world that was never about Urban 24, never about the empire, just about where I came from. I said nothing. Not because I was afraid. Because I was calculating. I have built my entire career on reading structural weaknesses before they become visible cracks. A building doesn't collapse in a day. It collapses because someone ignored the hairline fracture for months, for years, until the weight finally found it. I know how to spot a hairline fracture. I have made a career of it, so when I started noticing the fractures in my own house, I didn't scream, I didn't confront, I watched, I documented, I waited, the way I wait for concrete to cure, patiently, because rushing it only weakens the foundation. I told myself I was protecting my family by staying quiet. That's the lie I let myself believe for years. Protecting the business. Protecting Siobhan's ego. Protecting the image of a united front for our son Kai, who was 11 years old and watched his parents build something extraordinary, and had no idea how hollow the frame had become underneath. I sacrificed sleep. I sacrificed friendships. I sacrificed asking for help, because asking felt like admitting the empire I built with my bare hands was cracking, and I could not let anyone see that. Not Siobhan, not Zora, not the board, not even myself most days. There was a night, about 18 months before everything broke open, when I sat alone in my office on the 22nd floor, long after everyone else had gone home. I had a stack of invoices in front of me that didn't add up, not by a little, by hundreds of thousands of dollars, routed through a vendor I had never approved, for a subcontractor I had never heard of, on a project that existed only on paper. I remember picking up my phone to call Siobhan. I remember putting it back down. Because some part of me, the part that had learned to survive by watching for hairline fractures, already knew what I would hear if I asked him directly. I would hear a smooth, reasonable explanation. I would hear him tell me I was working too hard, seeing shadows, needing rest. I would hear him make me feel like the problem was my paranoia, not his signature on a shell company's incorporation papers. I decided that night I wasn't going to ask him anything. I was going to find out everything myself, and I was going to do it in a way he would never see coming. The next morning, I called my assistant, Nia, into my office and closed the door. Nia had been with me for 6 years. She started as an intake coordinator answering phones in a cramped satellite office before Urban 24 had its own tower. She rose because she was sharp, because she noticed things other people missed, and because she had never once, in 6 years, given me a reason to doubt her loyalty. I need you to pull every vendor contract signed in the last 24 months, I told her. I need bank routing information, cross-referenced against our approved vendor list, and I need this done quietly. No IT tickets, no shared drives, nothing that leaves a trail anyone but us can follow. She looked at me for a long moment. Nia was not naive. She had been in enough meetings, run enough errands, delivered enough documents between offices to have her own suspicions long before I said a word. "Is this about Mr. Cole?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. Some questions, once spoken aloud, can't be unheard, and I wasn't ready to hear my own answer yet. "This is about protecting what's mine," I said instead. "That's all you need to know right now." She nodded. Understood. That was the beginning. Not the courthouse, not the cameras, not the divorce papers that would come 14 months later on a rainy Tuesday morning. The beginning was that quiet conversation behind a closed door, when I stopped being a woman who trusted silently and became a woman who watched silently instead. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from loving people who are actively working against you while you're still setting the table for family dinner. I lived in that loneliness for over a year. I sat across from Siobhan at breakfast while Kai talked about his science fair project, and I watched my husband's hands, the same hands that had signed permit applications with my forged signature, pour syrup over pancakes like nothing in the world was wrong. I got very good at pretending nothing was wrong too. Zora would call me daughter in board meetings, would compliment my instincts in front of investors, would hug me at company holiday parties, while her personal assistant filed paperwork, rerouting maintenance contracts through a company registered to her cousin. I let her hug me. I hugged her back. I smiled for the photos. People think strength looks like confrontation, like standing up in a room and making everyone feel your anger. I used to think that too, when I was younger, and still believed the world rewarded people who spoke the loudest. But I didn't build a billion-dollar company by being the loudest person in the room. I built it by being the most prepared person in the room, every single time, long before anyone else understood what was actually happening. So while Siobhan and Zora believed they were slowly, carefully taking my company out from under me, I was doing the same thing to their confidence. Every calm smile I gave them, every meeting I let them run, every decision I let them believe was theirs. It was all documentation. It was all evidence that I was exactly the woman they thought I was. Trusting, tired, distracted, too in love with keeping the peace to notice what was happening around her. I let them believe that lie for 14 months, because that lie was the only weapon I needed. What I didn't know yet, what I couldn't have predicted, sitting in my office that first night with Nia, was how far Siobhan was willing to go. I thought I was documenting greed, embezzlement, a pattern of quiet theft dressed up as operational restructuring. I had no idea he was already planning to take my name off the company entirely. I had no idea the forged power of attorney sitting in a drawer in his office wasn't for company assets at all. It was for my mother's house. The one place in this world that had nothing to do with Urban 24. The one thing that was mine before I ever built an empire, and would still be mine after everything else was gone. I found out about that particular betrayal 3 months before the courthouse. And that was the moment the quiet documentation stopped being about protecting my company. It became about protecting my mother's memory and making absolutely certain that the man who tried to steal her house while smiling at her grandson across the breakfast table would lose everything he thought he'd already won. I didn't cry that morning I found the forged document. I didn't call a lawyer immediately, though Nia and I already had one working quietly in the background, retained under an unrelated holding company so no one would connect the dots back to me. I sat with the paper in my hands, in the study of the very house he was trying to steal, and I felt something settle in my chest that had nothing to do with sadness. It was clarity. I understood, finally and completely, what 14 months of silence had been preparing me for. Not revenge in the way people imagine it, not screaming, not slamming doors, not throwing his belongings onto the lawn for the cameras to capture. Something colder, something that would take his own board, his own signatures, his own arrogance, and turn every single piece of it into the instrument of his downfall. I put the forged document back exactly where I found it. I photographed it first, of course. Then I closed the drawer, walked out of the study, and went to find Kai to help him with his homework, because that was the life I was still, on the surface, protecting. Underneath it, though, something had already shifted permanently. I was no longer the woman quietly absorbing damage to keep her family together. I was building a case, and I intended to win it. The morning it happened, it was raining. Not dramatically, just a steady, gray Tuesday rain that soaked through my coat as I walked from the parking structure toward the courthouse steps. I was there for what I believed was a routine mediation session. Siobhan had requested it himself 2 weeks earlier, telling me it was time we formalized some things between us, given how distant we'd become. I remember thinking, even then, that his choice of words was strange. Formalized. Like I was a contract he was closing out. I should have known. I did know, in the part of my mind that had spent 14 months cataloging every calculated move he made. But there is a difference between knowing something intellectually and standing in the rain watching it happen to your face. He was already there when I arrived. Standing at the top of the courthouse steps in a charcoal suit that I recognized because I had picked it out for him 2 Christmases ago. Beside him stood Zora, dressed like she was attending a press conference rather than her son's divorce filing, and behind them, unmistakably, a small cluster of people holding cameras and microphones. My stomach dropped before my mind caught up to what I was seeing. Raven, Siobhan's voice carried down the steps toward me, pitched just loud enough for the cameras to catch clearly. "I'm glad you could make it." I stopped at the base of the steps, rain running down the back of my collar. "What is this, Siobhan?" He smiled. That smile I used to find charming, back when I still believed it meant something warm rather than something calculated. "This is where we finally get honest with each other," he said, "in front of the people who matter." He held out a folder. I didn't take it. I let it hang in the space between us, rain spotting the manila surface, until he set it down on the railing beside him instead. "Divorce papers," he said, loud enough for the microphones. "I've filed for full dissolution of our marriage, effective immediately." I felt the cameras before I fully processed his words. A dozen small red lights, all pointed at my face, waiting to capture exactly how a woman looks when her husband destroys her publicly. I gave them nothing. I have spent my entire career training my face not to react to bad news in front of people who want to see me break. Board members who doubted my projections. Contractors who tried to renegotiate terms mid-build, betting I'd cave under pressure. I learned a long time ago that the moment you let your face show the wound, you hand your opponent the exact leverage they're looking for. So I stood there, rain soaking through my coat, and I let my face stay perfectly, deliberately still. "That's your right," I said evenly. "Was there something else, or did you gather the press just to hand me paperwork you could have had a lawyer mail?" Something flickered across his expression, a flash of irritation that told me my calm wasn't landing the way he'd hoped. He recovered quickly, turning back toward the cameras with practiced ease. "There's one more matter," he said. "Effective this morning, Raven Cole has been removed from her position at Urban 24 Group. The board has voted to restructure leadership, and I will be assuming the role of Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately." The rain kept falling. I kept my expression still. But inside, something sharpened into focus with a clarity I hadn't expected, even after 14 months of preparation. He said the board voted, not I decided. He was building a narrative, live, in front of cameras, that this wasn't a hostile takeover by an ambitious husband, but a legitimate corporate decision made by people with actual authority. "On what grounds?" I said. "Would the board vote to remove the company's founder without a formal meeting, without notice, without my presence?" Zora stepped forward then, her voice dripping with rehearsed sympathy. "Raven, sweetheart, we've all seen how exhausted you've been, how distracted. The board felt it was time to bring in stable leadership before the company suffered any further. Further, as if there had already been damage. As if she and Siobhan hadn't spent 14 months manufacturing precisely the kind of instability they were now using as justification to remove me. I looked at her for a long moment, rain dripping from the edge of my umbrella, and I let myself feel something close to admiration for how thoroughly she had constructed this moment. It was elegant, in its own cruel way, a public ambush disguised as an intervention, a theft disguised as concern, You built this narrative well, I said quietly, just for her. I'll give you that. Her performative warmth cracked for half a second. Just half a second. A flicker of something underneath the composed executive mask. Not triumph. Fear. The kind of fear you see in someone who has convinced themselves their plan is airtight, right up until the moment their opponent looks them in the eye without flinching. That flicker told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a sudden decision. This was a plan they'd been building for months, and somewhere underneath Zora's confidence was the terror of a woman who understood, on some level, that she was betting everything on me being too broken to fight back. She had no idea I'd already built the case that would end her. Kai doesn't know about any of this yet, does he? I said. Not a question, a statement, delivered quietly enough that the microphones wouldn't catch it, but close enough that Shavon heard every word. His jaw tightened. That was the first genuine reaction I'd gotten out of him all morning. Leave him out of it. You're the one who scheduled a press conference for your own son's mother's public humiliation, I said. I'm not the one who forgot he exists in all of this. Raven. His voice had an edge now, the smooth performance slipping slightly. This doesn't have to be ugly. It isn't ugly, I said. It's just over. I turned to look directly into the nearest camera. I hadn't planned to say anything for the press. I had planned to stay silent, to let them have their moment, to walk away and let the paper trail do the talking, 14 months from the day it started. But something in me needed them to see, right now, in this moment, that I was not the broken woman they were counting on. Urban 24 Group was built from nothing. I said, my voice steady, carrying clearly despite the rain. By me. Every brick, every contract, every job created in this city traces back to decisions I made when no one else believed in this vision. I have full confidence the board and I will resolve this matter through the appropriate channels. It was a controlled statement. Vague enough to give nothing away. Firm enough to plant a seed of doubt in anyone watching who might have assumed this board decision was as clean as Shavon wanted it to look. Shavon's smile tightened. The board's decision is final, Raven. We'll see, I said. I turned and walked back down the steps into the rain, leaving him standing there with his cameras, and his mother, and his folder of papers, still holding on to the illusion that he'd won something. I didn't cry in the car. I sat in the driver's seat for exactly 4 minutes. Engine off, rain drumming against the roof, and I let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Not sadness, something closer to recognition. The final piece of confirmation I needed, delivered publicly, on camera, in front of witnesses. Shavon and Zora had shown their hand completely. They believed they had won. They believed the board vote was legitimate. The narrative was airtight, and I was too depleted to fight back. I picked up my phone and called Nia. It happened, I said, when she answered. Courthouse, press, all of it. There was a brief pause on the line. Are you all right? I'm better than all right, I said. I need you to pull everything, all 14 months. Every document, every bank record, every forged signature. I want it organized and ready within the week. For what? I watched Shavon through my windshield, still standing on the courthouse steps, shaking hands with a reporter, basking in what he believed was his victory. For the board meeting I'm about to call, I said. The real one. Nia didn't ask any more questions. She simply said, I'll have it ready. I hung up and sat there a moment longer, watching the rain streak down the glass, watching Shavon's silhouette grow smaller as reporters packed up their equipment, and the small crowd dispersed. He thought this was an ending, a clean, public severing of my name from the company I built, my identity from the empire I spent my life constructing. He had no idea it was the beginning of the end for him. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking structure, already composing the meeting request in my head. 14 months of patience had brought me here, to this exact moment, and I intended to make every single day of that patience count. The board meeting wouldn't happen tomorrow. It wouldn't happen next week. It would happen when every document was verified, every account traced, every signature analyzed by a forensic expert who could stand in front of the board and testify, without doubt, that Shavon Cole had committed fraud against the company that bore his wife's life's work. I drove home in the rain, already calculating dates, already drafting the language of the meeting invitation I would send to every board member except Shavon and Zora, already imagining the exact moment his composure would break in front of the same people he'd just convinced to hand him my company. He wanted a public spectacle. Fine, I would give him one. Just not the kind he was expecting. The 14 months before the courthouse were the most disciplined period of my entire life, and I have run a company through 3 economic downturns. It started small. A single folder on a personal laptop Siobhan had never touched, stored on an external drive I kept in a safety deposit box under my maiden name. Nia and I built a system together. She called it the ledger, though it grew into something far more complex than a simple accounting record. Every Tuesday and Thursday, after the office emptied out, Nia and I would meet in a small conference room on the 4th floor, a room nobody used because the projector had been broken for 2 years and no one had bothered to fix it. Nobody comes looking for evidence in a room everyone assumes is useless. "Walk me through the Kestrel Holdings transfer," I said one evening, maybe 5 months into our investigation, spreading a printed bank statement across the table between us. Nia pulled up the corresponding invoice on her tablet. Kestrel Holdings was paid $240,000 for site remediation work on the Baymont project. Except, she scrolled, cross-referencing, the Baymont project's remediation was completed 8 months before this invoice was dated. And this is the 4th payment to Kestrel this year, all roughly the same amount. "Who owns Kestrel Holdings?" "It took some digging," Nia said. "The registered agent is a law firm in Delaware, but the incorporation documents list a secondary contact email." She turned the tablet toward me. The email domain matched Zora's personal foundation, the one she ran under the guise of community outreach. I felt the click of confirmation settle into place, the way a load-bearing beam settles once it's properly seated. "She's laundering money through a fake remediation contractor," I said quietly. "It gets worse," Nia said. "I found 3 more shell entities using nearly identical structures. Different names, same Delaware registered agent, same pattern of invoices for work that was either never done or already completed under a different vendor." I sat back in my chair, running the numbers in my head. How much total? Conservatively, just over $4 million. Over the past 3 years. $4 million. Money that should have gone into worker wages, into site safety upgrades, into the neighborhoods I'd spent my career trying to rebuild. Instead, it had been quietly siphoned into shell companies controlled by the 2 people I trusted most in this world outside of my own son. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam my hand on the table. I picked up my pen and wrote the figure at the top of a growing spreadsheet, the same way I would document a structural defect on a building inspection. "Keep going," I said. "Find everything." Over the following months, the picture grew larger and more damning than either of us had anticipated. It wasn't just embezzlement. Siobhan had been quietly reassigning contracts away from vendors I'd spent a decade building relationships with, replacing them with companies connected to his and Zora's inner circle. He was diverting our best subcontractors, the ones who'd been loyal to Urban 24 since our earliest, leanest years, onto smaller jobs, while funneling our largest, most profitable contracts to firms that existed almost entirely on paper. I had built relationships with those loyal vendors myself, back when I was still hammering nails alongside them on job sites at 6 in the morning. Watching Siobhan quietly starve them out while I sat across from him at dinner, listening to him talk about streamlining operations, took a discipline I didn't know I had until I was forced to practice it every single day. There was one night, around month 9, when I almost broke. Kai had a school event, a science fair, the same one he'd been talking about for weeks, and Siobhan showed up late, smelling faintly of the kind of expensive cologne I didn't recognize, kissing my cheek in front of the other parents, like nothing in the world was wrong between us. "You okay?" he asked, noticing something in my expression I hadn't fully managed to hide. "Tired," I said. "Big week at the office." "You work too hard," he said, and there was something in his voice, genuine concern, maybe, or a very good imitation of it, that made me question, for one brief moment, whether I was building a case against a monster or simply misreading a man under his own kind of pressure. That doubt lasted exactly as long as it took Nia to text me later that night with a screenshot of a wire transfer, $1,200, from the Kestrel Holdings account, to a florist that had delivered flowers to an apartment neither Siobhan nor I owned 3 weeks earlier. I didn't confront him about the apartment. I didn't need to. It wasn't jealousy driving me at that point. The marriage had been hollow for years, and some distant part of me had already grieved it long before the courthouse made it official. What mattered was the pattern. Every thread I pulled revealed another, and another, until I understood I wasn't dealing with a husband who'd made a few questionable financial decisions. I was dealing with a coordinated, sustained campaign to strip me of everything I'd built, executed with enough patience and precision that it could only have been planned from the very beginning of our marriage, or very close to it. The forged power of attorney was the discovery that changed everything. I found it by accident, technically, though nothing in those 14 months was truly accidental. I had trained myself to notice anomalies the way I noticed hairline cracks in concrete. I was searching Chevon's home study for a set of house insurance documents I needed for an unrelated matter, and I found a folder tucked behind a drawer divider, labeled simply Collier Heights. Collier Heights! My mother's house. The house I grew up in. The house she left to me specifically, by name, in a will I had filed and recorded myself. Inside the folder was a power of attorney document, dated 6 months earlier, granting Chevon full authority to manage and sell the Collier Heights property on behalf of Raven Cole, due to health incapacitation. My signature was on the bottom of the page, a signature I never wrote. I sat on the floor of that study for a long time, holding a document that proved my husband had not only been robbing my company for years, but had taken concrete legal steps toward stealing my mother's house, the one thing in this world that had nothing to do with Urban 24, nothing to do with the empire, nothing to do with anything except the woman who raised me and the home she left behind. I photographed every page. I called Nia that same night, though it was nearly midnight. "He's trying to sell my mother's house," I said, and for the first time in 9 months, my voice shook. There was a pause on the line. "Raven, I need you to breathe." "I am breathing," I said. "I'm breathing, and I'm about to make sure he loses everything." The next day, we retained a forensic document examiner through the unrelated holding company our attorney had set up, specifically to keep any of this from tracing back to me prematurely. The examiner confirmed within a week what I already knew. The signature was forged, and not particularly well. Whoever forged it had rushed, or grown overconfident, assuming no one would ever scrutinize it closely enough to notice the inconsistencies in pressure and stroke pattern that a professional eye catches immediately. I kept the forged document, the examiner's report, and copies of the shell company incorporations in a physical lockbox at a bank branch across town, one Chevon had no reason to know I used. Nia was the only other person with access. We built the case the way I build buildings, layer by layer, each piece load-bearing, each piece verified before we moved to the next. By month 12, we had 4 inches of documentation: bank records, forged signatures, shell company filings, vendor contracts diverted through Zora's network, testimony, quietly gathered, from 2 former employees who'd been pushed out of the company after raising concerns about irregular invoices, both of whom agreed to speak on record once they understood I was building a case, not just venting a grievance. By month 13, I had identified every board member who remained loyal to me versus those Chevon and Zora had been quietly courting behind my back. I made calls. Careful, measured calls, framed as routine check-ins, during which I gathered just enough information to understand exactly who would need to see the evidence and who was likely already compromised. By month 14, 3 days before the courthouse, I had everything I needed. The only thing I was waiting for was the moment Chevon showed his hand publicly, the moment he made his move against me in a way so blatant, so undeniable, that no board member could later claim they didn't understand the full scope of what he'd done. I didn't know the courthouse ambush was coming on that specific rainy Tuesday, but I knew it was coming soon. Nia had picked up whispers weeks earlier that Chevon was preparing something, some kind of announcement, and I understood enough about his ego to know he would want an audience for it. So when he stood on those courthouse steps with cameras rolling, announcing my removal from the company I built, he believed he was delivering the final blow. He had no idea he was walking directly into the trap I'd spent 14 months constructing. I went home that rainy afternoon, changed out of my soaked coat, and sat down at my kitchen table with Nia on a video call, both of us reviewing the final draft of the emergency board meeting request I intended to send the following morning. "He thinks it's over," Nia said. "Let him think that," I said. "For 1 more week." I looked at the lockbox key sitting on my kitchen table, the same key I'd carried in my coat pocket for the past 4 months, ever since the paper trail had grown too thick to keep anywhere but a bank vault. 14 months of silence. 14 months of smiling across dinner tables at a man who was actively destroying everything I'd built. 14 months of watching Zora call me daughter, while her cousin's shell company drained millions from the business I'd built with my own 2 hands. I had absorbed every bit of it without flinching, because I understood something Shevin never grasped about the woman he married. I didn't build Urban 24 Group by reacting emotionally to obstacles. I built it by studying every weakness in a structure until I understood exactly where to apply pressure to bring the whole thing down cleanly, without unnecessary collateral damage. Shevin was a structure with a hairline fracture running straight through his foundation, and he had just handed me, on camera, in front of witnesses, the exact justification I needed to apply pressure precisely where it would do the most damage. I sent the board meeting request the next morning, emergency session. 12 days out. Enough time for the forensic examiner to finalize her written report, enough time for our attorney to prepare formal documentation, enough time for every board member to clear their calendar for what I described, in deliberately understated language, as a matter of urgent corporate governance, requiring the board's immediate attention. I did not mention Shevin by name. I did not mention Zora. I let the vagueness do its work, let their curiosity and mild unease simmer for 12 days, while I finalized every last piece of the case that would end them. Nia and I met one final time in the fourth-floor conference room with the broken projector, 3 nights before the meeting, laying out every document in the exact order I intended to present them. "Are you ready?" she asked. I looked at the stack of paper in front of me. 4 inches thick, 14 months of patience, distilled into evidence no board member could argue with, no attorney could discredit, no amount of Shevin's charm could talk his way around. "I've been ready for 14 months, I said. "Now it's just time." The boardroom on the 12th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the 6 city blocks I'd spent my career transforming. I chose that room deliberately. I wanted every board member sitting at that table to be able to look out the window at the exact skyline my work had built, while they listened to exactly how close they'd come to handing that legacy to a man who'd stolen it through fraud. Shevin arrived 12 minutes late, which told me everything about his mindset before he even sat down. He walked in wearing the same kind of confidence he'd worn on the courthouse steps, settling into the seat at the head of the table. My seat, the one I'd occupied at every board meeting since I founded the company, without a flicker of hesitation. Zora sat beside him. She'd dressed for triumph, in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than most of our former subcontractors made in a month, back before Shevin quietly starved them of contracts. "Raven," Shevin said, glancing at me across the table with an expression that tried for warmth, but landed somewhere closer to condescension. "I appreciate you calling this meeting. I think it's important we handle the transition properly, for the sake of the company." "I agree completely," I said. "That's exactly why I called it." I watched something flicker behind his eyes, a small, involuntary flash of uncertainty. He'd expected me to arrive angry, or pleading, or defeated. Instead, I arrived calm, composed, with a leather folio in front of me, and Nia seated to my right, a laptop open, ready. The board members filed in one by one, 8 in total, not counting Shevin and Zora. I'd spoken privately with 5 of them over the preceding 2 weeks, careful, measured conversations designed to gauge loyalty without revealing my hand. The other 3 remained a question mark, and I intended to answer that question definitively within the hour. Once everyone was seated, I stood. "Thank you all for clearing your schedules on short notice," I said. "I know some of you are wondering why I called this meeting rather than accepting the board's decision from 2 weeks ago without contest. I'm going to answer that question directly, and I'm going to answer it with evidence, not emotion." Shevin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Zora's manicured hand tightened around her water glass. 14 months ago, I continued, I discovered irregularities in our vendor payment structure. What I initially believed might be an accounting error turned out to be something far more serious. With the help of my assistant, our forensic accountant, and an independent document examiner, I have spent the past 14 months building a complete record of financial fraud committed against this company. I nodded to Nia. She turned her laptop toward the large screen at the end of the room, and the first document appeared. The Kestrel Holdings Incorporation filing, the Delaware registered agent, the secondary contact email tracing back to Zora's foundation. Kestrel Holdings received $240,000 for remediation work on the Baymont project, I said. Work that had already been completed 8 months earlier by our verified vendor. This is one of 4 shell entities that received a combined $4 million over 3 years for work that was either duplicated, never performed, or entirely fabricated. I let the number sit in the silence for a moment. I watched two of the previously uncommitted board members exchange a glance. "That's a serious allegation," one of them said carefully. Marcus Webb, a longtime board member who'd been with the company almost as long as I had. "It's not an allegation," I said. "It's documented, verified, and cross-referenced against bank records, which I'm happy to make available to independent auditors immediately following this meeting." Zora spoke up, her voice sharp with practiced indignation. "This is absurd. You're trying to smear us because you're bitter about the board's restructuring decision." "I understand why you'd want this to look like bitterness," I said, turning to face her directly. "It's a much more sympathetic narrative than the truth." I nodded to Nia again. The next document appeared, the forged power of attorney. The room went very still. "This document," I said, "was found in a folder labeled Collier Heights in my husband's home study. It grants him full authority to sell my mother's historic home, a property she left to me by name in her will. The signature on this document is mine, except I never signed it." I heard the sharp intake of breath from someone at the table. I kept my eyes on Siobhan. "I retained a forensic document examiner independently," I continued. "Her report, which I'll distribute to every board member after this meeting, confirms conclusively that this signature is forged. Inconsistent pressure, inconsistent stroke pattern, clear indicators of an inexperienced forgery." Siobhan's composure finally cracked. "This is insane, Raven. You're grasping. You've built some kind of conspiracy theory because you can't accept." "I have 3 years of bank statements," I said, my voice level, cutting cleanly through his protest. "I have vendor contracts diverted to companies controlled by your mother's associates. I have testimony from 2 former employees who were pushed out of this company after questioning irregular invoices. I have a forged legal document with my name on it that you used to attempt to sell my late mother's house." I paused, letting the weight of each item settle before delivering the final piece. "And I have the timeline," I said. 14 months of documentation, cross-referenced, verified, and legally admissible. I built this company from nothing, and I have spent the last 14 months proving, beyond any reasonable doubt, exactly how you and your mother attempted to steal it." The room was completely silent. I looked around the table, watching the faces of board members I'd worked alongside for years, watching the reality settle over them one by one. Marcus Webb was staring at the screen, his expression hardening with something between disbelief and fury. Another board member, Patricia Nguyen, had already pulled out her phone, presumably to notify legal counsel. "I want to be very clear about what happens next," I said. "This is not a personal dispute I'm asking this board to referee. This is a matter of fraud, forgery, and breach of fiduciary duty, committed by a sitting board member and his mother against the company and its founder. I am formally requesting the board vote to remove both Siobhan Cole and Zora Cole from any position of authority within Urban 24 Group, effective immediately, and to authorize full cooperation with law enforcement regarding the forged legal documents presented today." "You can't do this," Zora said, her voice rising for the first time, the composed executive mask finally slipping entirely. "You have no proof any of this. I have 4 inches of proof sitting in a lockbox," I said quietly, "verified by an independent forensic accountant and a certified document examiner, and copies of every page have already been sent to this board's outside legal counsel this morning, along with a formal notice of the fraud claims." That last detail, the fact that outside counsel already had everything, was the piece that finally broke through Siobhan's composure entirely. He understood, in that moment, that this wasn't a confrontation he could talk his way out of. There was no room in this scenario for his charm, his smooth, reasonable voice, his practiced ability to make me sound irrational in front of an audience. "Raven." His voice had lost all of its earlier confidence. "Can we discuss this privately? We're well past private discussions," I said. "You made this public, on courthouse steps, with cameras. You wanted an audience for your version of events. I'm simply providing one for mine." Marcus Webb cleared his throat. "I move that we proceed to an immediate vote on removal of Siobhan Cole and Zora Cole from all positions and board authority within Urban 24 Group, pending full cooperation with a forensic audit and any resulting legal action." "Seconded," Patricia Nguyen said without hesitation. The vote was unanimous. Every board member, including 2 I hadn't been certain of, voted for immediate removal. I watched Chevan's face as the final vote was tallied, watched the exact moment he understood that everything he had spent months, maybe years, orchestrating had just collapsed in the span of 40 minutes. In the same boardroom he'd sat in with such arrogant confidence less than an hour earlier. "Effective immediately," I said. "Both of you are stripped of all authority, access, and title within this company. Security has already been briefed to escort you from the building. Your legal counsel will be hearing from ours within the hour." Zora stood so abruptly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "You planned this. This entire meeting. You planned this, to humiliate us." "No," I said, meeting her eyes without flinching. "You planned the humiliation. On courthouse steps, with cameras rolling, 14 months after you started stealing from me. I simply waited until you'd built enough rope to hang yourselves with." Chevan didn't say anything else. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the documents still displayed on the screen. The shell companies, the forged signature, the $4 million, as if trying to find some argument, some angle, some version of events that could undo what had just happened. There wasn't one. Security arrived within minutes. I watched them approach the table, watched Chevan rise slowly, his earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by something smaller, something that looked almost like disbelief, that a plan this carefully constructed could unravel this completely, this fast. "This isn't over," he said quietly, as security guided him toward the door. "It is for you," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. 14 months of silence had built to exactly this moment, and I intended to spend the rest of it exactly as calm and composed as I'd been walking into the room. I watched them go through the glass doors of the boardroom, security on either side, Zora's voice still rising in protest even as the elevator doors closed between us. I stood at the window, looking down at the 6 city blocks I'd rebuilt from nothing, and I let myself feel, for the first time in 14 months, the full weight of everything settling into place. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter than that. Relief, maybe, mixed with a kind of exhaustion I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge while the case was still being built. The elevator carrying Chevan and Zora reached the ground floor, and through the lobby's security camera feed, which Nia pulled up on her tablet without my asking, I watched their reflections move across the polished glass doors leading out to the street. Zora, no longer the untouchable executive who'd called me daughter at company parties while draining $4 million from the business, walked out into the same gray afternoon light that had been falling on the city all week. For a moment, in the reflection, she looked small. Not powerful, not composed. Just a woman who had mistaken control for connection, and lost both. Chevan didn't look back at the building. I noticed that. Whatever calculation was running through his mind as he stepped onto the sidewalk, it didn't include a final glance up at the tower he'd tried to steal. I turned away from the window before the reflection disappeared entirely. There was work to do, and I didn't intend to spend it dwelling on the exact shape of their humiliation. The forensic audit began within 48 hours, conducted by an independent firm the board approved unanimously, with full access to every account, every vendor contract, every piece of documentation Nia and I had already gathered over 14 months. It confirmed everything. The 4 shell companies, the diverted contracts, the pattern of embezzlement stretching back nearly 3 years, longer than I had initially realized. What the audit also revealed, which I hadn't fully appreciated until I saw it laid out in aggregate, was the scope of damage done to employees who had nothing to do with the fraud itself. 6 project managers had been quietly passed over for promotions they'd earned, their positions instead filled by people connected to Zora's network. 12 field supervisors had gone without contractual pay increases for over 2 years, the funds redirected instead toward shell company payments. A safety inspector named Daniel Ruiz had been fired 18 months earlier after raising concerns about a subcontractor's credentials. The same subcontractor, it turned out, was one of Zora's shell entities operating under a different name. I called Daniel Ruiz myself. I didn't delegate that call to HR, or to Nia, or to anyone else. I sat in my office, the same office where I'd first started documenting irregularities 14 months earlier, and I called a man whose career I had allowed to be quietly destroyed by people I trusted, because I hadn't been watching closely enough, soon enough. "Mr. Ruiz," I said when he answered, "this is Raven Cole. I understand you were terminated from Urban 24 Group 18 months ago, and I'd like to speak with you about what actually happened." There was a long pause on the line. I figured nobody wanted to hear that story anymore. I do, I said, and I owe you an apology, and considerably more than that. Within the week, Daniel Ruiz was reinstated with full back pay and a formal, documented apology from the company. He wasn't the only one. Over the following month, I personally reviewed every case the audit flagged, every unfair termination, every denied promotion, every withheld raise, and I restored what I could. Back pay, promotions, formal apologies where they were owed. I didn't do it publicly. I didn't call a press conference or issue a statement about corporate accountability. I simply made it right, quietly, the way I believed things should have been handled from the beginning, if I hadn't let silence become my default response to everything uncomfortable in my life. Nia found me in my office one evening, weeks into the restoration process, going through the final list of affected employees. You didn't have to do all of this personally, she said. HR could have handled the back pay. I know, I said, but they didn't lose their positions because of a policy error. They lost them because Siobhan and Zora were building an empire on top of people who trusted this company. I want them to hear directly from me that it's being corrected. Nia was quiet for a moment. Have you heard anything from Kai's side about all this? How he's processing it? I set down the folder I was holding. That question sat heavier than any of the financial figures I'd been reviewing for weeks. He knows the basic outline, I said, that his father did something wrong at the company, and that the board removed him. I haven't told him about the forged document for the house yet. I'm not sure he's ready to hear that his father tried to steal his grandmother's home. Will you tell him eventually? When he's older, I said. For now, he needs to know his mother handled it. That's enough. The legal proceedings against Siobhan and Zora moved forward separately from the corporate restoration, a matter for prosecutors and civil attorneys, not something I needed to manage personally, beyond providing the documentation our legal team had already assembled. Siobhan was formally charged with fraud and forgery within 6 weeks of the board meeting. Zora faced her own set of charges related to the shell company operations. I testified once, briefly, in a preliminary hearing, presenting the same calm, documented account I'd given the board, without embellishment, without theatrics. I ran into Siobhan exactly once after that boardroom meeting, in a courthouse hallway during a preliminary proceeding related to the divorce finalization. He looked different, thinner, somehow, the polish that used to define him worn away by weeks of legal pressure and public scrutiny. You destroyed me, he said, quietly, as we passed each other near the elevator bank. I stopped and looked at him for a long moment. No, I said, you destroyed yourself. I just made sure everyone could see it clearly. I didn't wait for a response. I stepped into the elevator and the doors closed between us, and I felt nothing that resembled satisfaction or cruelty. Just a clean, quiet closure. The kind you feel when a structural repair finally holds under load, when a fracture you spent months reinforcing stops threatening to spread. The company itself stabilized faster than I expected. With Siobhan and Zora's network fully removed from vendor relationships, contracts naturally flowed back toward the loyal subcontractors who'd been quietly starved for years. Within 3 months, Urban 24 Group's project timelines improved, worker retention climbed, and the 6 city blocks I'd originally built the company around were joined by 2 new development projects I'd been planning long before the courthouse, long before any of this began. Nia was promoted to Chief of Staff, a position I created specifically because there was no way I would have survived those 14 months, let alone built the case that ended them, without her steady, meticulous loyalty. You know, she said, during one of our final debriefs on the audit process, you never once panicked. In 14 months. Not once. I panicked plenty, I said. I just didn't let it change what I did next. That, I've come to understand, is the actual difference between the people who survive betrayal and the people who are consumed by it. Not the absence of fear or pain, but the discipline to keep building even while you're afraid, even while everything in you wants to react instead of plan. I thought, in the weeks following the boardroom confrontation, that I would feel triumphant, vindicated. Instead, mostly, I felt tired, in the particular way you feel after finishing a project that consumed every ounce of your attention for over a year. Relieved, yes, but also aware of exactly how much of myself I had spent surviving a betrayal I never should have had to survive in the first place. I gave myself permission, for the first time in longer than I could remember, to simply rest. 3 months after the board meeting, I sat on the front steps of my mother's house in Collier Heights on a Sunday afternoon, watching Kai toss a basketball against the side of the garage. The same garage my mother used to store her gardening tools in when I was a child. The house had survived, untouched by everything Shevin had tried to do to it. The forged power of attorney sat now in an evidence file, part of a criminal case moving steadily through the courts, and the deed remained exactly where it belonged, in my name. Exactly as my mother intended when she left it to me. Kai flopped down on the step beside me, breathing hard from running. "Mom," he said, "are you and Dad ever going to be friends again?" I considered the question carefully. My son deserved an honest answer, delivered in a way that didn't burden him with more than an 11-year-old should carry. "I don't think we'll be friends," I said, "but I don't want you to worry about that. What happened between your dad and me doesn't have anything to do with how much I love you, or how much he loves you, even if he made some very serious mistakes." Did he really try to sell Grandma's house? I hadn't told him that directly. Someone must have mentioned it. A classmate, a relative. The particular way children absorb fragments of adult conversations they weren't meant to hear. "He did," I said. "But he didn't succeed, and this house isn't going anywhere. It's yours someday, the same way it's mine now." Kai was quiet for a moment, processing that in the careful, serious way he processed most difficult information. A trait I recognized in him because I saw it in myself. "I'm glad you won," he said finally. "Me too," I said. I looked out at the street, the same street I'd grown up on, the same porch, where my mother used to sit with a glass of sweet tea in the evenings, watching the neighborhood settle into dusk. I thought about the version of myself who had sat in a parking structure 14 months earlier, watching rain streak down a windshield, absorbing the full weight of a public betrayal without letting a single crack show on my face. That version of me had believed, for most of her life, that strength meant silence. That protecting the people she loved meant absorbing damage quietly, sacrificing her own peace to maintain the appearance of a stable, united front. I understood now how wrong that belief had been. Silence hadn't protected my family. It had given Shevin and Zora 14 months of cover to build a fraud scheme that nearly cost me everything. The company, my mother's house, possibly even my relationship with my own son, had they succeeded in painting me as unstable or incapacitated. What had actually protected everything I valued wasn't silence. It was patience paired with action, the discipline to watch, document, and prepare, combined with the willingness to act decisively the moment I had what I needed. Urban 24 Group was thriving again, stronger in many ways than before. Rebuilt on relationships with the loyal vendors and employees who had waited out the storm alongside me, whether they knew it or not. Nia ran operations with a precision that freed me to focus on the long-term vision I'd originally built the company around. Not just development, but genuine investment in the communities we built within. I thought about Zora's reflection disappearing in those glass lobby doors, the image Nia had shown me on the security feed weeks earlier. A woman who had mistaken control for connection, who had believed that manipulating her way into power was the same as earning it, and who lost everything the moment someone patient enough, prepared enough, refused to let her walk away with what she'd stolen. I thought about Shevin's voice in that courthouse hallway. "You destroyed me," and the particular satisfaction of understanding, completely, that he was wrong. I hadn't destroyed him. I had simply stopped protecting him from the consequences of his own choices, and stopped protecting myself from the truth of what he'd become. Kai picked the basketball back up and jogged toward the garage, resuming whatever imaginary game he'd been playing before he sat down beside me. I watched him for a while, this 11-year-old boy who had no idea how close he'd come to losing his grandmother's house, how close his mother had come to losing everything she'd built, and how much quiet, deliberate work had gone into making sure neither of those things happened. I am no longer a woman who mistakes silence for strength. I am no longer someone who absorbs betrayal quietly to keep the peace, who sacrifices her own protection because asking for help feels like admitting weakness. I built Urban 24 Group out of nothing, with my own hands, and I rebuilt it again after two people I trusted tried to take it from me. I protected my mother's legacy, restored the careers of employees who were wrongfully pushed aside, and did all of it without raising my voice, without theatrics, without giving anyone the satisfaction of watching me break. The sun was starting to lower over Collier Heights, casting long shadows across the same lawn where I used to play as a child, where my mother used to call me in for dinner, where I now sat as a woman who had rebuilt her entire life from a foundation of patience and quiet, ruthless resolve. I am a builder. I have always been a builder. And I finally understand that the most important thing I ever built wasn't the company, the buildings, or the empire everyone associates with my name. It was this: the peace of sitting on my mother's porch, watching my son play in the fading light, knowing that everything I love is finally, completely protected. I built that too, and no one will ever take it from me again.